Picture a floating city. 3 football fields long, a 20-story building rising from one side, and a flat deck so massive it could park 90 aircraft weighing 15,000 pounds each. Now imagine this entire structure weighing 36,000 tons, that's 72 million pounds, sitting in the middle of the Pacific Ocean during a typhoon. The wind screams at 100 miles per hour. Waves tower 3 stories high. The ship rolls and rolls, 45 degrees to one side. But here's what doesn't make sense. It doesn't capsize. December 1944, Typhoon Cobra slams into Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet east of the Philippines. 3 destroyers, the USS Hull, Monaghan and Spence, flip over and sink. 790 sailors die. Yet the aircraft carriers, with their massive flight decks catching wind like sails and their island superstructures looking impossibly top-heavy, somehow stay upright. 4 months later, on March 19, 1945, the USS Franklin takes 2 Japanese bombs straight through her flight deck while 50 miles from Japan. Explosions rip through aircraft being armed with fuel and ammunition. 724 men die in minutes. The entire ship erupts in flames. All power dies, and the Franklin develops a 13-degree list, leaning hard to one side, dead in the water. Every instinct says this ship is going down. Instead, she sails 12,000 miles home to Brooklyn under her own power, the most heavily damaged carrier to survive World War II. The answer isn't what you think. It's not the wide hull, though that helps. It's not some secret technology or active stabilization system. World War II carriers had none of that. It's about a point you can't see, located somewhere most people would never look, governed by a principle discovered 2,200 years ago in a bathtub. And when you understand it, you'll never look at an aircraft carrier the same way again. Welcome to WW2 Objects, where every object tells a story. Hold that image of the USS Franklin in your mind. Flight deck destroyed, superstructure burning, island structure, that 60-foot-tall building on the starboard side, still standing. Everything above the waterline looks like dead weight pulling the ship over. But here's what you can't see from the photographs. 28 feet and 7 inches below the waterline, the hull extends down into the ocean. And in that hidden space beneath the waves lives everything that makes an Essex-class carrier actually work. 4 massive steam turbine engines, each weighing hundreds of tons. Steel armour plating, up to 4 inches thick in critical areas. It's wrapping the hull and protecting magazines. Ammunition storage for the ship's guns. Shells that weigh 2,700 pounds each. Aviation fuel tanks holding thousands of gallons. Machinery spaces. Generators. Pumps. The ship's entire circulatory system. Engineers calculated that approximately 70% of the carrier's total weight sat below the waterline. Not because they wanted it there for looks, because that's where physics demanded it be. Think of it like a fishing bobber. The colourful part you see floating on the surface is plastic and lightweight, but underneath there's a lead weight you never see. When a fish tugs the line, the bobber might dip and wobble, but that hidden lead weight pulls it back upright. An aircraft carrier works on the same principle, except instead of a lead weight, it's turbines, armour, fuel, and ammunition, creating what naval architects call the centre of gravity. By 1943, when Essex-class carriers entered mass production, 24 would eventually be built. Designers had calculated the centre of gravity to sit approximately 18 to 20 feet below the waterline. That's the point where all the ship's weight balances, and critically, it's below the surface of the ocean. Compare that to the destroyers that capsized in Typhoon Cobra. Smaller ships, less displacement, higher centres of gravity relative to their hull depth. When those ships rolled in the storm, the physics worked against them. but Essex-class carriers displacing 36,380 tons at full load. The sheer mass of water they displaced created an enormous upward force, what Archimedes figured out in that famous bathtub. When the ship rolled to one side, the shape of the hull meant more volume went underwater on the low side, creating more buoyancy, pushing back against the roll. Now here's what soldiers didn't know while they were running across that flight deck, launching F-6F Hellcats and TBM Avengers. Every single aircraft they sent into combat represented just 0.02% of the ship's total displacement. Launch 20 aircraft simultaneously? You've shifted 0.4% of the ship's weight. The stability didn't even notice. Here's where it gets fascinating. Imagine you're standing on a ship's deck during a roll. The ship tilts 15 degrees to starboard. You feel yourself leaning. Your brain screams that you're about to flip over. But the ship feels something entirely different. When an aircraft carrier rolls, two invisible forces engage in a battle. Now, the first is the centre of gravity, that point 18 to 20 feet below the waterline where all the ship's weight concentrates. The second is the centre of buoyancy, the geometric centre of all the water the hull displaces, which shifts as the ship rolls. Here's the critical part. When the ship rolls to one side, the centre of buoyancy moves outward toward the low side because more of the hull is now underwater there. But the centre of gravity, anchored by all that machinery, armour and fuel deep in the ship, barely moves at all. This creates what naval architects call the righting moment. Picture two people on a seesaw. If one person is much heavier and sits closer to the middle, while a lighter person sits at the far end, the heavier person still wins. Now, the carrier's massive low weight creates a moment arm, a lever effect that fights against the rolling force. The measurement that matters is called metacentric height. That's the vertical distance between the centre of gravity and a theoretical point called the metacentre, where the buoyancy force acts. For Essex-class carriers, this was approximately 6 to 8 feet, enough to create powerful righting moments even during extreme rolls. Now you might be thinking, but what about all those aircraft on the flight deck? What about the island superstructure? That has to make the ship top-heavy. Sure, but let's do the math. The island structure on an Essex-class carrier, that entire 60-foot building containing the bridge, radar, communications, represented less than 5% of the ship's total weight. The 90-plus aircraft typically carried, but altogether they weighed roughly 1.35 million pounds. Sounds massive, until you remember the ship itself weighs 72 million pounds. The aircraft are less than 2% of total weight. An Essex-class carrier could lose every single aircraft, thrown overboard by a typhoon or destroyed in an attack, and the centre of gravity would rise by barely half a foot. But here's what made these ships truly ingenious: the ballast system. As carriers burned fuel during operations, sometimes 500 tons in a single day of combat flight operations, the ship got lighter and the centre of gravity rose slightly. Engineers compensated by pumping seawater into ballast tanks in the double-bottom hull, adding weight back low in the ship. A 1944 engineering log from the USS Yorktown notes transferring over 500 tons of ballast water after a full day of flight operations to maintain proper trim. The ship constantly adjusted its own stability. Not with computers or gyroscopes. Those didn't exist on WW2 carriers. Just valves, pumps, and careful calculations by men monitoring fuel levels and weight distribution. One final detail that changed everything: the hull shape below the waterline. December 18th, 1944. The Third Fleet is refuelling at sea when Typhoon Cobra strikes. The destroyers USS Hull, Monaghan, and Spence don't just sink, they capsize, roll over completely. Witnesses report seeing them flip so fast that sailors on deck had no time to reach life jackets, the carriers survive, but barely. Ships record rolls up to 45 degrees. That's halfway to horizontal. Everything not welded down becomes a projectile. In one carrier's hangar bay, aircraft break loose from their tie-downs and slide across the deck, smashing into each other, rupturing fuel tanks. Men grab onto anything fixed to hold on, but the ships keep coming back upright. Here's why. That metacentric height, that righting moment, that low center of gravity creates what engineers call a restoring force. The farther the ship rolls, the stronger the force pushing it back. At 45 degrees, the buoyancy force on the low side of the hull creates an enormous lever arm around the center of gravity. The ship doesn't want to stay rolled. Physics won't allow it. The destroyers that capsized had metacentric heights of only 3 to 4 feet, half that of the carriers. Their centers of gravity were higher relative to their displacement, and when they rolled past a critical angle, somewhere around 30 to 35 degrees, depending on sea state and damage, the restoring force disappeared. They reached what's called the angle of vanishing stability. Past that point, the ship prefers to be upside down. Essex-class carriers, with their massive displacement and carefully calculated weight distribution, had angles of vanishing stability well over 40 degrees in intact condition. Even damaged, even flooding, even with fires raging topside, they had margins. The Franklin proved it. March 19, 1945, 50 miles from Japan. 2 bombs detonate on the flight deck during arming operations. The resulting fires and explosions kill 724 men, the highest death toll of any US warship that survived the war. The ship develops a 13-degree list to starboard. All power is lost. No pumps, no steering. A dead in the water with Japanese air bases minutes away. What saves her? Damage control teams manually opening valves to counter flood compartments on the opposite side. By deliberately flooding spaces on the port side, adding weight to the high side, they create an opposing moment that brings the ship closer to level. It's the same principle as that metacentric height, but applied manually. Add weight to the high side, create a restoring force, fight the list. The Franklin makes it to Pearl Harbor, then to the Panama Canal, then to Brooklyn Navy Yard, 12,000 miles under her own power with a destroyed flight deck. The engineering holds. Before we finish, there's one myth we need to destroy: the idea that modern carriers need fancy stabilization systems to stay upright. WW2 Essex-class carriers had 0 active stabilization, no gyroscopes, no fin stabilizers, no computers monitoring roll and automatically adjusting ballast. Just steel, water, and the laws of physics working exactly as Archimedes described in ancient Syracuse. Modern supercarriers do have fin stabilizers, but not to prevent capsizing. They're there for comfort, to reduce the rolling motion so flight operations are smoother and sailors aren't seasick. The fundamental stability still comes from that same principle: center of gravity low, displacement high, metacentric height sufficient to create restoring forces. That 1940s engineering, calculated with slide rules and confirmed in sea trials, still governs the design of every carrier afloat today. So the next time you see footage of an aircraft carrier in a museum documentary or parked at a pier looking impossibly top-heavy, remember what you can't see. You'll know it's not just the wide hull keeping it upright. It's that invisible point 20 feet below the waterline, where 70% of the ship's weight concentrates. It's the thousands of tons of steel and machinery that soldiers never saw but always depended on. It's the genius of engineers who understood that to keep something floating upright, you first have to pull it down. Thank you for watching WW2 Objects. If you have suggestions for other WW2 items we should cover, from naval innovations to aircraft components to battlefield equipment, leave them in the comments below and we'll give you a shout out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story from the battlefield.